The bitter December wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls as Violet Kensington draped a threadbare blanket over her husband's body. James had been dead for exactly 9 hours, claimed by the ruthless pneumonia that had swept through Florence, Arizona territory like a vengeful ghost. 1881 had been a year of loss for so many, but for Violet, on this cold morning, the world had ended. Her shaking hands smoothed down the collar of the only good shirt James had owned, a pale blue cotton number he'd worn on their wedding day 4 years earlier. The homestead they had carved from the unforgiving land sat 3 miles outside of town, isolated and now terrifyingly empty, except for the echo of her sobs. "What am I supposed to do now?" she whispered, her breath forming a small cloud in the frigid air of the cabin. 24 years old and a widow, no children, no family within 1,000 miles, and the harshest winter in 20 years pounding at her door. A sharp knock startled her from her grief. She wiped her face with her sleeve and opened the wooden door to find Sheriff Morris standing there, hat in hand, his weathered face grim beneath his gray mustache. "Mrs. Kensington, I heard about James. I'm mighty sorry for your loss." Violet nodded, unable to speak. "Thing is, madam, Doc Sullivan says we can't keep the deceased in homes with this sickness going around. I've brought the wagon to take him to the undertaker's." Reality crashed down on her with brutal force. "Now, but I'm sorry, madam, town council's orders." 2 men appeared behind the sheriff, faces solemn. One was the undertaker's assistant. The other was a man she'd never seen before, tall, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything about her situation in a single glance. He wore a worn leather coat dusted with snow, and despite the solemn occasion, he stood with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. As the men entered to take James away, the stranger lingered by the door. "Name's Daniel McCall, madam. Just rode into town yesterday." Sheriff asked if I could help. "I'm real sorry about your husband." Violet barely acknowledged him, her eyes fixed on the men wrapping James in a sheet. When they carried him out, she followed to the porch, hugging herself against the cold as they loaded her husband's body onto the wagon. After the wagon disappeared down the snow-covered trail, Sheriff Morris turned to her. "Mrs. Kensington, how are you fixed for the winter?" The question caught her off guard. She hadn't thought beyond the next breath, let alone the coming months. I don't know. You got family you can go to?" "No, everyone's back east." The sheriff exchanged glances with Daniel McCall. "Madam, with all respect, a woman alone out here with winter coming on strong. It ain't safe." "This is my home," she said, suddenly fierce. "James and I built it together. I understand that, but I'm staying." Her voice was flat with the finality of it. What did it matter if she survived the winter or not? James was gone. Sheriff Morris sighed. "At least let me send someone to check on you regular like. McCall here is staying through winter, working odd jobs. He's handy with repairs, hunting, that sort of thing." Daniel McCall stepped forward, his expression serious. "I'd be happy to help out, madam. No strings attached." Violet looked at him properly for the first time. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 28 or 30. His eyes were a deep brown, almost black in the weak winter light. There was nothing threatening in his manner, but she was in no state to make decisions. "I don't need charity," she said finally. Daniel's expression didn't change. "It's not charity if you need firewood chopped and I need the work. Sheriff says your husband kept some livestock. I can help tend them too for fair pay." Violet realized with a jolt that she hadn't even thought about the animals. 2 milk cows, some chickens, and James's horse. She had no idea how to manage alone. "I can pay a little," she conceded quietly. Sheriff Morris nodded, clearly relieved. "He'll come by tomorrow to help get things squared away." The funeral will be day after next once the ground thaws enough to dig. After they left, Violet stood in the doorway of the empty cabin, the cold seeping into her bones. She had never felt so utterly alone. True to his word, Daniel McCall arrived early the next morning. Violet had barely slept, haunted by the empty space beside her in the bed. When she heard him outside, she opened the door to find him already unloading firewood from a small wagon. "Morning, Mrs. Kensington," he said, tipping his hat. "Brought some extra split wood to get you through a few days. You didn't have to do that. Winter's coming on hard. Everyone needs extra." He nodded toward the barn. "Thought I'd check on your livestock first, if that's all right." Violet wrapped her shawl tighter. "The barn door sticks in the cold. You have to lift it while you push." Daniel nodded and headed for the barn. Violet watched him go, noting the confident set of his shoulders, the easy way he moved. He wasn't from around here. His accent had hints of Texas, maybe, but softer. There was something compelling about him, an air of quiet capability that made her feel slightly less adrift. She put coffee on the stove and tried to focus on practical matters. The funeral, bills to be paid, food stores that needed to last until spring. By the time Daniel returned from the barn, she had regained some composure. "Your animals are doing fine," he reported, stomping snow from his boots at the door. "Gave them fresh feed and water." "Thank you," she said, gesturing to the coffee pot. "Would you like some?" He hesitated briefly before accepting. "Much obliged." They sat in awkward silence at the small kitchen table as he sipped his coffee. Finally, he spoke. "Sheriff mentioned you're determined to stay out here. This is my home." "It's a good piece of land," he agreed. "But winter's going to be brutal this year. Signs are all pointing that way." "I'll manage." Daniel studied her for a moment. "Mrs. Kensington, Violet," she corrected. "If you're going to be helping out, you might as well use my name." "Violet," he repeated, and something in the way he said it made her look up. "I don't mean to speak out of turn, but grief and winter are both hard enough on their own. Together they can be overwhelming." Her throat tightened. "What would you know about it? More than I'd like." He didn't elaborate, just set his empty cup down. "I'll be straight with you. Sheriff's worried about you being out here alone. So's the doctor. There's talk in town about having you stay with the preacher's wife until spring." Anger flared in her chest. "They have no right." "No, they don't," he agreed. "Which is why I proposed an alternative. I'll check on you daily, help with the heavy work, make sure you've got what you need. In exchange, I could use a place to stable my horse and maybe sleep in your barn on the coldest nights. Been paying for a room at the boarding house, but it's eating through my funds faster than I'd like." Violet stared at him, weighing his offer. Having someone check on her daily would keep the townspeople from forcing her to leave, and she knew she couldn't manage everything alone. Still, "I barely know you," she said finally. "That's fair. Ask around town about me. I've done work for several folks already. Sheriff can vouch for me too." "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. "I know what it's like to be alone when the world falls apart. No one should have to face that with no help at all." Something in his voice rang true, and Violet found herself nodding slowly. "All right, but I insist on paying you for your work." "We'll figure something fair," he said, rising. "I'll finish with that firewood now." The next day was James's funeral. A small gathering of townspeople stood in the cemetery as the preacher spoke words that seemed to float away on the bitter wind. Violet stood rigid, dry-eyed, having spent all her tears in private. Daniel McCall stood a respectful distance behind her, and she was absurdly grateful for his solid presence. Back at the cabin afterward, he built up the fire while she mechanically served coffee, and the food neighbors had brought to the few people who came to pay their respects. When everyone had gone, Violet found herself standing in the middle of the room, suddenly unsure what to do next. Daniel placed another log on the fire. "It's getting colder. Might be in for more snow tonight." "Yes," she said, grateful for something practical to focus on. "I noticed your east window has a draft. Mind if I take a look at it tomorrow?" She nodded, and he gathered his coat. "I'll be back in the morning," he said. "If you need anything before then, Sheriff knows where to find me." After he left, Violet sank into James's chair by the fire. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt a tiny flicker of hope that she might actually survive this winter after all. Over the next week, Daniel came each day as promised. He repaired the drafty window, chopped enough firewood to last through several storms, and helped with the animals. Violet insisted on cooking him a meal each day in partial payment, and gradually, their initial awkwardness gave way to a quiet companionship. She learned he was 31, had grown up on a ranch in West Texas, and had spent the last few years drifting through the territories, taking work where he could find it. He didn't volunteer much more than that, and she didn't pry. December deepened, bringing with it a fierce blizzard that howled for 3 days straight. On the second night, Violet woke to pounding on her door. She grabbed James's old revolver from beside the bed and approached cautiously. "Who's there?" "It's Daniel," came the muffled reply. She opened the door to a blast of snow and wind, and Daniel stumbled in, covered in white from head to toe. "Sorry to wake you," he gasped, breathing hard. "Barn roof started to collapse from the snow. Got the animals out, but they need shelter." Violet threw on her coat. "The storage shed, too small. I've brought them to your porch for now." Together they worked to clear a space in the cabin's attached storage room. Daniel led the frightened animals inside 2 cows, 4 chickens in a crate, and both horses. It was cramped and far from ideal, but it would keep them from freezing to death. By the time they finished, they were both exhausted and freezing. Violet built up the fire while Daniel checked that all the animals were settled. "You're soaked through," she observed when he returned. "You'll catch your death." "Wouldn't be the first time I've been wet and cold," he said, but his teeth were chattering. "There are some of James's clothes in the trunk," she said, surprising herself with the offer. "They might fit you well enough until yours dry." Daniel hesitated. "I don't want to impose. It's practical, not an imposition." She gestured to the puddle forming at his feet. "And you're ruining my floor." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Yes, madam." While he changed behind the privacy screen in the corner, Violet heated soup on the stove. The storm continued to rage outside, rattling the windows. "I don't think you should try to make it back to town tonight," she said when he emerged wearing James's flannel shirt and an old pair of trousers. They were a bit short on him, but otherwise fit well enough. "The animals need watching anyway." Daniel nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the arrangement but seeing the sense in it. "I can sleep on the floor by the fire." Violet brought him a bowl of soup and a blanket. They ate in silence, listening to the wind howl. When they finished, Daniel insisted she take the bed while he made himself comfortable near the hearth. Lying in the darkness, Violet was acutely aware of his presence. It was the first night since James's death that she hadn't been alone in the cabin, and strangely, rather than feeling like an intrusion, it was comforting. She fell asleep to the sound of his steady breathing mixing with the crackling of the fire. The blizzard lasted another full day. By unspoken agreement, Daniel stayed, helping Violet reinforce the barn with what materials they had on hand. They worked side by side, speaking little but developing a rhythm that surprised her with its ease. When evening came, they shared another quiet meal. "My husband and I were going to add a proper room to the barn this spring," Violet said suddenly, breaking the silence. "He had all the plans drawn up." Daniel glanced up from his stew, It's good land, worth improving. You think I'm foolish, trying to stay here alone?" He considered this seriously. Not foolish, brave maybe, stubborn definitely. This surprised a small laugh from her. "James always said I was the most stubborn woman he'd ever met. Sounds like he knew you well." Daniel's eyes held genuine warmth. "He did." She swallowed hard. "We were going to start a family this year. I'm sorry." Violet looked away, blinking back tears. "I keep thinking if I'd gotten the doctor sooner or if I'd recognized how sick he was getting." "Don't," Daniel said gently. "That path leads nowhere good. Believe me, I know." Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. "You lost someone too," he nodded, his expression closing slightly. "My wife, and our son. 5 years ago now. I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Cholera took half our town in Texas. After that, I couldn't stay there." Understanding bloomed between them, a recognition of shared grief that needed no further words. They finished their meal in a silence that felt almost companionable. The following morning, the storm finally broke. Daniel moved the animals back to the repaired barn and prepared to return to town. "I'll be back tomorrow," he assured her. "Need to bring more supplies anyway." "Thank you," Violet said simply. "For everything." He nodded, touching the brim of his hat, and rode out. Watching him go, Violet realized that for the first time since James's death, she had gone several hours without that crushing weight of grief pressing down on her chest. The realization brought both relief and guilt. The weeks before Christmas passed in a blur of short, dark days. Daniel came faithfully each morning, helping Violet prepare for the deepening winter. He taught her how to set snares for rabbits, showed her how to repair harnesses, and reinforced the cabin walls against the cold. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Violet began to emerge from the fog of her grief. There were still nights when she cried herself to sleep, still mornings when she reached for James before remembering. But increasingly, there were also moments of peace, even occasional laughter when Daniel told stories of his travels. Christmas Eve arrived with another heavy snowfall. Violet had invited Daniel to share the holiday meal, and he arrived bearing unexpected gifts: coffee, sugar, and a small pouch of dried cranberries. "Town got a supply wagon through yesterday," he explained. "Thought these might brighten your Christmas dinner." Violet was touched by his thoughtfulness. She had prepared a modest feast: a chicken from her own coop, potatoes she'd stored in the root cellar, and bread she'd baked that morning. She had also secretly made Daniel a new pair of leather gloves, noting how worn his old ones had become. They ate by lantern light, the cabin warm and fragrant with cooking smells. Outside, the snow continued to fall silently, blanketing the world in white. "I never thanked you properly," Violet said as they finished their meal. "For staying, for helping me." Daniel looked slightly embarrassed. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she shook her head. "They wouldn't. The sheriff wanted to send me to town. You're the one who suggested another way." He shrugged. "You deserve to keep your home. Still, thank you." She hesitated, then reached into her sewing basket and pulled out the wrapped gloves. "I made these for you, for Christmas." Daniel looked genuinely surprised. "You didn't have to do that. I wanted to." He unwrapped them carefully, running his fingers over the stitching. "These are finely made." "Thank you. Try them on. I had to guess at the size." He pulled them on, flexing his fingers. "Perfect fit." Violet smiled, pleased. "Good. Your others were falling apart." "Been meaning to replace them," he admitted. "Just hadn't gotten around to it." As he prepared to leave later that evening, the snow was still falling heavily. "Maybe you should stay," Violet suggested, peering out at the weather. "It's Christmas Eve and the snow's getting worse." Daniel hesitated. "I don't want folks in town to talk." "Let them talk," she said with sudden fierceness. "I'm a grown woman. I can decide who stays in my home." He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "If you're sure." "I am." That night, like the time during the blizzard, Daniel slept by the fire while Violet took the bed. But something had shifted between them, a cautious friendship deepening into something neither was ready to name. Christmas morning dawned clear and brilliantly cold. They shared a simple breakfast before Daniel headed out to tend the animals. When he returned, his expression was grave. "We might have trouble," he said. "There's a pack of wolves moving through the area, found tracks all around the barn." Violet's heart sank. "The livestock, they're safe for now, but we'll need to be vigilant. Wolves get desperate this time of year." For the next several days, Daniel stayed at the homestead, sleeping in the barn to keep watch over the animals. Each morning, they found fresh wolf tracks circling the property, and twice they heard howling in the night. On New Year's Eve, Violet insisted Daniel join her in the cabin for dinner. "It's too cold in that barn," she said firmly, "and we should mark the turning of the year together." They shared the last of the Christmas chicken, now made into a stew, and Violet surprised him with a small bottle of whiskey she'd been saving. "James was keeping it for a special occasion," she explained, pouring them each a small measure. "This seems fitting." They toasted the new year in front of the fire, both lost in their own thoughts about the year that had passed and the one to come. "What will you do when spring arrives?" Violet asked suddenly. Daniel looked into his glass. "Haven't thought that far ahead. Keep moving, I suppose. That's what I've done these past years. No place feels like home, not since I left Texas." Violet nodded, understanding. "After James died, I thought I'd never feel at home here again, but lately. It's starting to heal," he finished for her. "Yes," she met his eyes. "Having you here has helped." Daniel looked away, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "You're strong, Violet. You'd have made it through regardless." "Perhaps, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out." As midnight approached, they stepped outside briefly to look at the stars. The night was clear and bitter cold, the snow crunching beneath their boots. Their breath formed clouds in the frigid air. "Make a wish for the new year," Violet said impulsively. Daniel glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. "What would you wish for?" She considered this seriously. "To find peace, I think. To remember James without this pain, to feel alive again. That's a good wish." "And you?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "To stop running, maybe, to find a reason to stay somewhere." Their eyes met, and for a breathless moment, something electric passed between them. Then a wolf howled in the distance, breaking the spell. They hurried back inside to the warmth of the cabin. January brought the coldest temperatures Violet had ever experienced. The water in the bucket would freeze solid overnight, and it took hours to thaw it by the fire each morning. Snow piled so high around the cabin that Daniel had to shovel paths to the barn daily. The wolf pack remained a constant threat. Twice they attempted to get into the barn, and Daniel had to fire warning shots to drive them away. After the second incident, he moved back into the cabin, taking turns with Violet to keep watch through the night. These quiet night hours, with one of them sitting by the fire while the other slept, created an unexpected intimacy between them. Sometimes they talked in low voices about their pasts, Daniel sharing stories of his ranch in Texas, Violet describing her childhood in Missouri. Other times they simply shared the silence, drawing comfort from each other's presence. One particularly bitter night in late January, Violet awoke to find Daniel adding wood to the fire, his face drawn with exhaustion. He had taken the first watch while she slept. "You should rest," she said, rising from the bed. "I'll take over." He shook his head. "Can't sleep anyway." "Thinking too much." "About what?" "The past. Mistakes I've made." Violet wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and joined him by the fire. Do you want to talk about it? Daniel stared into the flames. When my wife and son got sick, I was away, driving cattle to market by the time I got back. There was nothing you could have done, she said gently. Maybe, maybe not, but I should have been there. I understand guilt, Violet said quietly. I keep thinking about James's last day. He didn't want me to go for the doctor, said it was just a cold, that I shouldn't risk the weather. By the time I went anyway, it was too late. Daniel looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. We can't change the past. No, but it changes us. They sat in silence for a while, shoulders almost touching, finding solace in shared regrets. Spring will come, Daniel said finally. Things will be easier then. Will they? Some things. The cold, the isolation, and the grief, he considered this. It changes, becomes part of you but not all of you. Violet studied his profile. Is that where you are now? It's part of you but not all, some days. Other days it still feels like everything. He glanced at her. But being here with you, it's helped me too. The simple admission touched Violet deeply. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand. They sat like that, fingers intertwined, watching the fire burn down to embers. February brought no relief from winter's grip. If anything, the cold intensified and supplies began to run dangerously low. The trail to town was often impassable, forcing Daniel and Violet to ration carefully. One evening, as a fierce wind battered the cabin, Daniel returned from checking the animals with frost rimming his beard and concern in his eyes. Feed's running low, he reported. Maybe a week's worth left. Violet's stomach tightened. And town, trails blocked again. Last I heard, the mercantile was running short too. Whole territories suffering. They sat at the small table, contemplating their options. The situation was becoming dire. Without feed, the livestock wouldn't survive, and without the livestock, Violet's chances of maintaining the homestead come spring would be slim. We could slaughter one of the cows, she suggested reluctantly. It would mean meat for us and less feed needed. Daniel shook his head. They're too valuable for the future. We need another solution. What about hunting? Game's scarce, and the wolves make it dangerous to go far. They fell silent, the severity of their predicament hanging heavy between them. There's a settlement about 20 miles north, Daniel said finally. Hammond's Creek. It's in a sheltered valley, might not be as cut off as Florence. I could try to make it there, see if they have supplies to spare. Violet's heart clenched at the thought. That's too risky. The weather, the wolves. We're running out of options. Then I'll go with you. Daniel looked at her in surprise. Violet, no, it's too dangerous. This is my homestead, my responsibility, she insisted. And two have a better chance than one if there's trouble. They argued back and forth, but Violet remained adamant. Finally, Daniel conceded, knowing her stubborn nature by now. We'll leave at first light, he said. Pack only what's essential. If the weather holds, we can make it there and back in 3 days. That night, as they prepared for the journey, the atmosphere in the cabin was tense. Both understood the risks they were taking, but neither saw any alternative. You should take the bed, Violet said as they finished their preparations. You'll need your strength tomorrow. Daniel shook his head. So will you, we both should rest. An awkward silence fell between them. Then Violet said quietly, the bed's big enough for both of us, we can share it, just to sleep, she added quickly. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. If you're sure. They lay down fully clothed, a respectful space between them. Despite the propriety they maintained, there was something profoundly intimate about sharing the small bed, listening to each other's breathing in the darkness. Violet, Daniel said softly after a while. If anything happens to me tomorrow, don't, she interrupted. Nothing's going to happen. If it does, he persisted, I want you to know that meeting you, being here these past weeks, it's meant something to me. More than I can say. Violet's throat tightened with emotion. It's meant something to me, too. In the darkness, his hand found hers, and they fell asleep with their fingers intertwined. Morning came with unexpected mercy-clear skies and slightly warmer temperatures. They set out at dawn, bundled against the cold, riding Daniel's horse and leading the pack-horse behind them. The snow was deep, forcing them to move slowly, but the trail north was relatively clear. They rode double, Violet seated behind Daniel, her arms around his waist for balance. The physical closeness felt both strange and natural, a continuation of the bond that had been growing between them. By midday, they had covered nearly half the distance to Hammond's Creek. They stopped briefly to rest the horses and eat some dried meat and hard biscuits. If we keep this pace, we'll reach the settlement before dark, Daniel said, studying the sky. Weather's holding so far. But as afternoon wore on, clouds began to gather on the horizon. The temperature dropped and the wind picked up, driving stinging particles of snow into their faces. "Storm's coming," Daniel called over his shoulder. "We need to push faster." They urged the horses on, but the worsening conditions slowed their progress. As twilight approached, it became clear they wouldn't reach Hammond's Creek before dark. "There's an old line shack about a mile ahead," Daniel shouted over the rising wind. "Used to belong to the cattle company. We can shelter there for the night." The small cabin was barely more than a one-room shelter, long abandoned but still structurally sound. They led the horses inside. There was no separate stable, and quickly set about making it habitable. Daniel managed to get a fire going in the small stove, while Violet brushed down the horses and fed them from their limited supplies. Outside, the storm howled in earnest, snow and wind battering the walls of the shack. "Looks like we made the right choice stopping," Daniel said, warming his hands by the stove. "This is turning into a bad one." Violet nodded, unpacking their meager provisions. "Will the supplies last for a day or two? After that, we'll have to push on regardless of weather." They ate a sparse dinner and settled in for the night. The shack was drafty but warmer than outside. With the horse's body heat and the small stove, it was almost comfortable. There was no bed, just the plank floor. They spread their bedrolls side by side near the stove and sat wrapped in blankets, listening to the storm rage. "James and I got caught in a blizzard once," Violet said suddenly. "First year we were married. We were coming back from visiting neighbors and got disoriented in the snow. Ended up huddled under an overhang for 2 days. Daniel smiled slightly. "Bet that tested the marriage early." "Actually, it strengthened it. There's nothing like facing danger together to show you what matters." She glanced at him. "What about you and your wife? Any adventures?" "Plenty." His expression softened with memory. "Sarah was fearless, always up for whatever came our way. When our son was born, I thought she might settle down, but she just strapped him to her back and carried on. She sounds remarkable." "She was." He poked at the fire. "After I lost them, I didn't think I'd ever feel connected to anyone again. Didn't want to." Violet understood completely. "It feels like betrayal, doesn't it? Finding any happiness after they're gone." "Yes," he said quietly. "But lately I've been thinking, maybe it's not betrayal. Maybe it's honoring what they gave us, the capacity to care, to connect." "Maybe," she whispered, looking into the flames. As the night deepened, the temperature in the shack dropped despite the fire. They eventually lay down to sleep, but even with all their blankets, the cold seeped through from the floor. "This isn't working," Daniel said after an hour of shivering. "We need to share body heat or we'll freeze." Violet hesitated only briefly before nodding. They pushed their bedrolls together and lay facing each other, sharing blankets and warmth. Daniel's arms went around her tentatively, and she nestled against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "Better," he murmured. "Yes," she whispered, surprised at how natural it felt to be held by him. They lay like that through the night, neither sleeping much but drawing comfort from each other's presence. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving a transformed landscape of pristine white snow. They continued their journey to Hammond's Creek, arriving by midday. The settlement was small but, as Daniel had hoped, less affected by the harsh winter. They were able to purchase feed for the animals and additional supplies for themselves. The return journey was arduous but uneventful. They spent another night in the line shack, once again sharing warmth through the cold hours of darkness. Something had changed between them, a barrier fallen away, a new understanding taking its place. When they finally reached the homestead, both were exhausted but triumphant. The animals greeted them eagerly, and the cabin, though cold from their absence, felt welcomingly familiar. "We did it," Violet said as they unloaded the supplies. "We did," Daniel agreed, his eyes warm as they met hers. That night, after they had tended to all the necessary chores and warmed the cabin, they sat together by the fire. Neither mentioned the intimacy they had shared during their journey, yet both felt its lingering effects. "Thank you for coming with me," Daniel said finally. "You were right, two were better than one. We make a good team," Violet replied softly. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then slowly reached out to touch her cheek. "Violet," he began, but seemed unable to continue. "I know," she whispered. "I feel it too." He drew her gently into his arms, and when their lips met, it felt like coming home after a long journey. The kiss was tender, questioning, a beginning rather than an end. When they parted, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "I didn't plan this," he said quietly. "I didn't expect. Neither did I." She curled her fingers into his shirt. "But I'm not sorry, are you sure? It's not too soon." Violet thought about James, about the grief that had nearly consumed her. "I'll always love him," she said honestly. "But my heart isn't buried with him. I think he'd want me to live to find happiness again." Daniel nodded, understanding completely. Sarah would feel the same. They spent the night together, their growing love a warm counterpoint to the winter's chill. It wasn't a betrayal of the past. They both understood, but a celebration of survival, of life continuing despite loss. The weeks that followed were some of the coldest of the winter, but inside Violet's cabin, warmth bloomed. Daniel moved in properly, no longer sleeping in the barn or by the fire but sharing Violet's bed. They worked together during the days, maintaining the homestead against winter's assault, and spent the evenings planning for spring. "We could expand the garden here," Daniel suggested one night as they pored over rough sketches of the property. "Plant more vegetables, maybe some fruit trees along the south slope. And finish the addition to the barn," Violet added. "There's room for more livestock if we're smart about it." Neither stated the obvious, that these plans assumed Daniel would stay beyond winter. It remained an unspoken question between them, growing more pressing as February waned. One evening in late February, as a rare break in the weather allowed them to sit outside and watch the sunset, Violet finally broached the subject. "When spring comes," she began carefully, "what are your plans?" Daniel was silent for a moment, his eyes on the horizon where the sun painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. "For 5 years, I haven't had plans beyond the next town, the next job," he said finally. "I've been running from memories, from putting down roots that could be torn up again." Violet nodded, understanding but afraid to hope. "But being here with you." He turned to face her, taking her hands in his. "It's made me want things I thought I'd never want again. A home. A future. Someone to share it with." Her heart swelled. "Are you saying you want to stay, if you'll have me?" he said simply. "Not just for spring, but for all the seasons to come." Tears pricked at Violet's eyes. "I want that too, so much." He pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that promised a lifetime of tomorrows. When they parted, both were smiling despite the tears on their cheeks. "I love you," Daniel said, the words both a declaration and a promise. "And I love you," Violet replied, her heart finally, fully open to this unexpected second chance. As February turned to March, the first subtle signs of winter's retreat appeared. The days grew slightly longer, the sun a touch warmer. Icicles began to drip from the cabin's eaves, and patches of earth emerged from beneath the snow. One morning, Daniel returned from checking the livestock with excitement in his eyes. "Come see," he said, taking Violet's hand and leading her outside. There, pushing through the snow at the base of a pine tree, was a tiny green shoot, the first harbinger of spring. Violet knelt beside it, touching the small leaf with gentle fingers. "It's really happening," she breathed. Daniel knelt beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "You'll see spring," he said softly. "I promised, remember?" She leaned into him, overwhelmed with emotion. "When you first said that, I didn't care if I saw spring or not. I just wanted the pain to end. And now I want to see everything spring, summer, fall, and all the years beyond. With you." As March progressed, the transformation of the landscape accelerated. Snow melted, revealing brown grass that quickly began to green. Birds returned, filling the mornings with song. The creek that ran along the edge of the property swelled with snowmelt, gurgling with renewed energy. Violet and Daniel threw themselves into spring preparations, repairing winter damage, preparing fields for planting, and caring for the animals. One of the cows gave birth to a healthy calf, a tangible symbol of new beginnings. In town, Daniel made arrangements to have his few possessions sent from the boarding house to the cabin. The news of their relationship had already spread in small communities. Such things rarely remained private, but the reactions were largely supportive. Many in Florence had worried about Violet's isolation and were relieved to see her finding happiness again. On the first truly warm day of spring, Daniel suggested they ride to a nearby ridge that offered views across the valley. They packed a simple picnic and set out, reveling in the ease of travel now that the snow had largely receded. The view from the ridge was spectacular: mountains in the distance, the town of Florence tiny below them, and their homestead visible as a cluster of buildings surrounded by greening fields. "It looks different from up here," Violet observed as they spread their blanket on a patch of dry ground. "Smaller but somehow more significant," Daniel nodded, unpacking their food. "That's how I felt the first time I saw it. Like it was exactly where I was meant to be, though I didn't understand why at the time." They ate in companionable silence, drinking in the beauty of the awakening landscape. After they finished, Daniel seemed uncharacteristically nervous, fidgeting with a small object in his pocket. "What is it?" Violet asked, noticing his distraction. He took a deep breath and pulled out a simple gold band. "I've been carrying this for a week, waiting for the right moment." Violet's breath caught as she recognized its significance. "I know it might seem fast," Daniel continued, "but when you've lost as much as we have, you learn not to waste time. I love you, Violet. I want to build a life with you right here on this land." Tears filled her eyes as he took her hand. "Will you marry me?" he asked simply. "Yes," she whispered without hesitation. "Yes, Daniel." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I've carried it all these years, never thinking I'd have a reason to pass it on." They sealed their engagement with a kiss that carried all the promise of the spring unfurling around them. When they finally parted, both were laughing and crying at once, overcome with joy. "When?" Violet asked, admiring the ring on her finger. "Whenever you're ready," Daniel replied. "I thought perhaps when the wildflowers bloom." "Perfect," she agreed, imagining the fields dotted with color. They rode home in the golden light of late afternoon, making plans for their future together. The homestead that had once seemed like a burden to Violet now represented everything she wanted: a place to build a life with Daniel, to create new memories while honoring the old. April arrived with an explosion of growth. The fields around the homestead erupted with wildflowers: blue lupines, orange poppies, and pink shooting stars. Trees burst into leaf, and the garden Violet and Daniel had planted began to sprout tender green shoots. They set their wedding date for the last Saturday in April, when the wildflowers would be at their peak. The ceremony would be small: just a few friends from town, the preacher, and the open sky above them. As the day approached, Violet found herself thinking often of James. Not with the sharp pain of early grief, but with a gentle gratitude for the love they had shared and the strength he had helped her discover in herself. "You think he'd understand?" she asked Daniel one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. Daniel didn't need to ask who she meant. "Yes," he said confidently. "Love doesn't diminish love. What you had with James made you who you are, the woman I fell in love with." Violet leaned against his shoulder. "I feel the same about Sarah and your son. They're part of you, part of what brought you here." "Life takes strange turns," Daniel mused. "If anyone had told me last fall that I'd find a home and a future here, I wouldn't have believed them. And if anyone had told me I could feel this kind of happiness again after losing James, I'd have called them a liar." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, secure in the knowledge that their past losses had led them to this unexpected joy. Their wedding day dawned clear and warm, the kind of perfect spring day that seems designed for beginnings. Violet wore a simple dress of pale blue, not the traditional white, but a color that suited her and the occasion. Daniel had purchased a new shirt and had his good trousers pressed in town. They exchanged vows in the meadow behind the cabin, surrounded by wildflowers and a small gathering of well-wishers. The preacher spoke of second chances and the resilience of the human heart. When it came time for their vows, both Violet and Daniel spoke from the heart, acknowledging the journey that had brought them together. "I promise to walk beside you through all seasons," Daniel said, holding Violet's hands in his. "To cherish each day we're given and face whatever comes together." "I promise to build a home with you," Violet responded, her voice steady and sure. "Not just of timber and nails, but of love and trust and shared dreams." As the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, a warm breeze swept across the meadow, setting the wildflowers dancing. It felt, to both of them, like a blessing. The small celebration that followed was joyful without being elaborate. Neighbors had contributed food and drink, and someone brought a fiddle for dancing. As the afternoon mellowed into evening, Violet and Daniel slipped away from the gathering, walking hand in hand to the ridge where he had proposed. The valley below was lush with spring growth, the setting sun painting everything in warm gold. In the distance, the mountains still held snow on their peaks, but here, life was bursting forth in every direction. "Mrs. McCall," Daniel said softly, drawing Violet into his arms. "How does it sound?" She smiled up at him. "Like the beginning of a wonderful story." "Our story," he agreed, kissing her gently. As they walked back to their home, truly theirs now, shared in every way, Violet thought about the dark December day when James had died. How she had believed her world had ended, that she would never feel warmth or joy again. And then Daniel had come, sitting beside her through the long winter nights, promising spring would come. He had been right about the seasons changing, about the earth renewing itself. What neither of them had anticipated was how their hearts would follow the same pattern, moving from the barren cold of grief to this abundant new growth of love. In the years that followed, the McCall homestead flourished. Daniel and Violet worked side by side, expanding the barn, adding to the house and increasing their livestock. The first winter they had fought simply to survive. Now they built for a future. Their first child, a son they named William James McCall, was born in the spring of the following year. As Violet held him in her arms, Daniel beside her with wonder in his eyes, she marveled at life's capacity for renewal, for joy after sorrow. "He has your eyes," Daniel whispered, touching their son's tiny hand. "And your stubborn chin," Violet teased gently. As William grew, the homestead expanded to match their growing family. They added 2 rooms to the cabin, planted an orchard, and built a proper corral for the horses. Daniel proved as skilled at fatherhood as he was at ranching, teaching William to ride almost as soon as he could walk. When William was 3, Violet gave birth to twin girls Sarah and Elizabeth. Their family felt complete, the cabin filled with laughter and the chaos of young children. On cold winter nights, they would gather by the fire, Daniel telling stories while Violet knitted. Sometimes, when the children were asleep, they would sit on the porch regardless of the weather, wrapped in blankets, looking at the stars and remembering that first difficult winter that had brought them together. "You ever regret it?" Daniel asked one such night, 5 years after they'd married. Staying here after James died, facing that winter alone, Violet considered the question seriously. "Not for a moment," she said finally. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it led me to you, to this life we've built." Daniel pulled her closer. "When I rode into Florence that day, I was just passing through, had no intention of staying more than a week or 2. The sheriff had other ideas," Violet laughed softly. "Best favor anyone ever did me," Daniel agreed, kissing her temple. As the years passed, Florence grew from a small settlement to a proper town. The territory became a state, bringing changes both welcome and challenging. Through it all, the McCall homestead remained a constant, a place of warmth and welcome, of hard work and deep love. William grew tall and strong, with his father's quiet confidence and his mother's determined spirit. The twins developed distinct personalities, Sarah bold and adventurous, Elizabeth thoughtful and artistic. All 3 children thrived in the freedom of their rural home, learning the rhythms of the seasons and the satisfaction of work well done. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Daniel surprised Violet with a 2-week trip to San Francisco, something neither had ever experienced. They left the children with trusted neighbors and traveled by train, marveling at the changing landscape and the bustle of the growing cities they passed through. San Francisco was a revelation, the vast ocean stretching to the horizon, the busy port, the elegant hotels. They walked arm in arm through the city streets, bought small gifts for the children, and spent evenings talking over everything they had seen. "It's a different world," Violet observed as they watched ships entering the harbor. "You wish we lived somewhere like this?" Daniel asked. "Somewhere with more. Everything?" Violet shook her head without hesitation. "Not for a minute. It's exciting to visit, but our place is back home." Daniel squeezed her hand, relieved. "I feel the same. This is wonderful, but it's not our meadow, our ridge, our home," she finished for him. When they returned to the homestead, the children ran to meet them, full of stories about their own small adventures. The cabin welcomed them back, familiar and beloved. That night, as they settled into their own bed, both agreed there was no place on earth they would rather be. As William approached his 18th birthday, he began to talk of college, perhaps in California or even back east. While both Violet and Daniel had mixed feelings about their son venturing so far from home, they supported his dreams. "We always wanted them to have choices," Daniel reminded Violet as they discussed it one evening. "Opportunities we didn't have." "I know," she sighed. "I just didn't expect him to choose quite so far away." The twins, now 15, were developing their own ambitions. Sarah spoke of becoming a doctor, inspired by Florence's new female physician. Elizabeth showed remarkable talent as an artist, filling sketchbooks with detailed drawings of the landscape and people around her. One crisp fall evening, as Violet and Daniel sat on the porch watching the sunset, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you remember that first winter?" she asked. "How you promised I would see spring?" Daniel smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling with the memories of shared years. "I remember how brave you were, how determined." "I wasn't brave," she disagreed. "I was just too stubborn to give up." "That's one kind of courage." He took her hand, the same gesture that had comforted her through those dark months. "You taught me how to stop running, how to build something lasting." Violet leaned against his shoulder, content in the life they had created together. "And you taught me that grief isn't the end of the story, that love can come again, different but just as true." As darkness fell, they remained on the porch, watching the first stars appear. The homestead was quiet around them, the children inside finishing homework. The livestock settled for the night. From this vantage point, they could see the ridge where Daniel had proposed, the meadow where they had married, the orchard they had planted together. "We've seen a lot of seasons change," Daniel mused. "And we'll see many more," Violet replied with certainty. They had faced hardships, droughts, storms, illnesses, but together they had weathered each challenge. The love that had begun in that desperate winter had deepened with each passing year, growing stronger and more resilient, like the roots of the trees they had planted. As they rose to go inside to their waiting family, Daniel paused, drawing Violet close for a kiss that held all the tenderness of their years together. "I'm glad I kept my promise," he whispered against her hair. "That you saw spring." "Not just spring," she replied, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "A whole lifetime of seasons, each one more beautiful than the last." Hand in hand, they walked into the warm light of their home, grateful for the winter that had brought them together and for all the springs that had followed.